Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, that staple of middle school poetry memorization, fairly sprung to mind this week as I considered the story of the Magi. And of course, as we have just read, the story of the Magi is only part of the story. It's part of a larger story, a tragic story that marks the birth of Jesus in Matthew's gospel narrative. As we read, it is not simply the story of three kings visiting Jesus with gold and frankincense and myrrh. By the way, their royalty as well as their names are later additions to the story, non-biblical wanderings of the imagination by Wordsworth and others, adding color to the story that we encounter in Matthew's gospel narrative. No, it's a story of a murderous tyrant and a family fleeing for their lives in fear. We know very little about Jesus' life at this point. We know even less about the wise men. But we know a little bit about Herod, though. We read from history and find out that he is a despot. We know from the pages of the gospel that he is a morally weak man. And plenty of flight of fancy will fill in whatever remaining gaps we have about Herod. One of my favorite comes from Barbara Brown Taylor, who writes of what the wise men, if by the way they were all men, found when they made their way to Herod's palace. The king they met was something of a disappointment. He was old and fat and he had terrible breath. His skin was yellow as if bile had gotten the best of him. And without even conferring with one another, the wise men knew that he was not the one. So they asked him if he knew of any other kings in the general area. What a difference it would have made if they had never asked. But there are some moves once taken, some paths once embarked upon that cannot be undone. The bell can't be unrung. The toothpaste is on the counter. It's not going back in the tube. Choose your analogy, but the truth remains. Actions have consequences. The choosing of a different path is as much a core value of Christianity as I can imagine. But even correcting course does not erase what has been done. I'm very mindful that this is the first Sunday of a new year. We are all flush with resolutions if we're going to make them. Some may even have endured to the 6th day of January. But even if we have resolved not to resolve, a new year nonetheless pushes the reset button on so much of life. Not all of it's fun. It's a new deductible for your insurance policies, a new tax year for business and personal life, a new Congress for those who watch such things. Everything is new and full of possibility. And the church tells us, as well it should, that our lives can be new also. And they can. Taking a different road is a vital part of Christian faith. We can lay down our guilt. We can lay down our mistakes. That is the purpose of so much confession. Week in and week out, we confess our sins. The knowledge that we can chart a new course. The only problem is that it just doesn't get rid of the consequences of our actions. Another path lies before us. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. How often is it that one or two, or maybe three or four paths that we consider can look so very similar. Indeed, it's possible for paths to look almost the same. If you stand, for instance, on the top of Dun-Ee, a rocky hill on the island of Iona in Scotland, there is a view that is unlike anywhere else in this world. If you look off to the east, there is the Isle of Mull, and just a little further off in the distance is the island of Staffa, and then there's Dutchman's Cap, and you can walk just a few feet, and really you can only walk just a few feet. It's tiny. Around the corner, and there you will find a fairy pool that every time of year is full of crystal clear water, in large measure because it's always raining in Scotland. It's absolutely captivating. And every time I have gone to the top of this little mountainette, so to speak, I've climbed up the same way. The path is worn into the hillside. It is boggy and it's rocky, and don't wear your good shoes for this trip because it starts off going through a sheep pasture. But then when you do finally get to the top and you look around and you take it all in, and it's time to go back down the hill, all the paths look the same. From the top of the hill, all the paths look nearly identical. But here is what I have learned by taking the other paths down. One ends in a sheer drop-off. You're not getting down that way unless you brought your climbing gear with you and you have considerably more skill than I do. Another winds its way through stinging nettles and requires far greater skill and athleticism to navigate than I have certainly these days. I've done that path one time, and it involved scraped palms and a muddy backside as I slid my way back down the hill. I have come to the conclusion that the only reason these other paths exist is because people have started down them, gone as far as they can possibly go before they realize it is a dead end, turned around and walked back. And yet, from the top, they look almost identical. Living in a time that seems to be struggling with moral ambiguity, sometimes the paths look awfully similar. And it is only by faithful discernment that we learn the difference. It is when the paths look almost exactly the same that mistakes are so often made, that wrong turns mark our journey. Just as we can't undo the consequences of our actions, neither can we pretend our actions have no value. Now, ideas, theories, and systems, these may be value neutral, but actions can't. They are, by definition, morally significant. Now, to be clear, every action is not the moral equivalent of hiding a victim or being a sympathizer, but all actions do have some moral value to them. Perhaps you've seen the NBC program, The Good Place. It is actually making moral reasoning cool again, and the premise of the program is that every action in life is either basically good or basically bad, and the only thing that varies is the value of the action. And again, I want to be very, very clear. God does not use a point system like they do in The Good Place, a point system to determine whether we are in or out of the kingdom. But our actions do have moral value. What difference might it have made for the Magi to ignore the vision and go back the way they came? I mean, I can't imagine the scenery changes that much in the desert. Why not just sneak back the most direct path and risk an encounter with Herod? What difference would it even make? Well, the Holy Family barely escaped. And the rest of the story in Matthew tells the sad history of Herod's quixotic rage and the wake of destruction it left. How we wish sometimes we could go back and take the other path. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I should ever come back. Just as we can't undo what has been done, and just as we must acknowledge that our actions have value, there is another truth that comes around whether we like it or not, and it is this: life can't be lived backwards. Time moves in only one direction unless you are God, and I am more than a little reticent to attempt to describe God's relationship to time, other than to say that eternal isn't the same as a really, really long time, or even forever. But for those of us who live our lives in linear time, in kairos time, chronos time, the story is always moving, a reality that is called to mind at times like the turning of the year. Almost never in life are we offered a do-over. We aren't offered a do-over on our marriages. We don't get a do-over on our children's childhood or their education. Rarely are we offered a true do-over in life. But do-overs and redemption are not the same thing. That's also a core value of Christian faith. Redemption is at the heart of what we proclaim. Have you ever had that moment where you were down in the dumps and someone offered you a kind word? The kind word didn't change whatever happened to put you down in the dumps, but it may have had the capacity to change your perspective, to lift your mood. That's just a small and imperfect analogy for redemption, but here's what we're trying to say. Redemption doesn't change the past, it changes the future. There's no version of the gospel story as related by Matthew that doesn't include the destructive rage of Herod. It is a fact of the story. Herod orders murder. Mary and Joseph and Jesus flee from Israel as refugees to Egypt, and there they stay until they learn that Herod is dead. They escape, but others do not. There is tremendous collateral damage that sweeps like a destructive wake behind the visit of the Magi. It's a terrible story. It's a terrible story. Thank God the gospel doesn't end there. Just as we thank God that the gospel doesn't end on Good Friday or even the Saturday after, but only on Easter morning with its good news of the resurrection. And note this, the resurrection doesn't change what happened on Good Friday. No, it is God's redemption of the cross. The resurrection changes the future. It does not change the past. The paths we take make a difference in our lives and in the lives of others. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and it has made all of the difference. What we're really saying is choices matter. That seems to be such a clear message from the text of the day, perhaps even a simplistic one, but it makes a difference which path we follow. It matters deeply if we hurt one another, and it matters deeply if we are kind to one another. I am not sure at all that is said nearly often enough. And if the church isn't saying it, then my gracious, who will? To each of our lives, in whatever measure grace is needed, it matters whether or not there is someone who will speak that redemptive word to us. And likewise, we should consider the moments when God calls us to speak a redemptive word to the situation that we are in. And likewise, with actions, although one could certainly make the case that words are actions, there are things that we are called to do to work with Jesus Christ for the redemption of the world. And whether or not we do them in large measure determines whether we are taking another road or staying on the path, perhaps of moral failure, but much more likely the path of moral mediocrity that allows us to blunder on year after year, not realizing the deprivation wreaked on our souls by our spiritual droughts. Oh, the Magi could have gone home the way they came, but it would have been a different story, wouldn't it? That's really the invitation of the gospel, to change the course of the story. To change the course of the story for good, to change the course of the story for love. And one final thought. I know full well that course changes can be unpredictable, and sometimes it will take not once or twice, but many times to change course. So I want to offer a final word of encouragement for those moments when we have tried and failed, perhaps not for the first time, or perhaps for those moments when life seems dull, or the inevitability of the politics of personal destruction winning out yet again, for those moments when the future seems full of uncertainty and we aren't at all sure that the path that we have chosen is the right one, or even how to get onto a different path. In those moments, remember this. In the final estimation, through the grace of Jesus Christ, all of our paths will ultimately get us home. And home is that place where we are always welcome, where the meal is laid out with the place at the table for every one of us.